Welcome to Horrified Stories, where if you comes to life don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Last Whisper in the Well. The village of Black Hollow was a place forgotten by time, nestled deep in a valley where the sun barely broke through the thick canopy of ancient trees. It thrived on old superstitions and whispered tales of curses that kept outsiders at bay. Its heart was a crumbling church, but its soul was the well, an ancient stone structure that stood in the center of the village square. The well had always been there, the villagers said, older than the church and the cottages that leaned against each other like weary travelers. Its stones were slick with moss, its depths swallowed sound, and no one could remember the last time anyone had drawn water from it. They all knew the story sure the well had once provided for the village, but how its waters turned sour one summer, bringing sickness and despair. The elders claimed it was cursed, that something evil had taken root in its depths. Now, children were forbidden to play near it, and even the bravest among the villagers avoided walking too close. But like all forbidden things, the well held a dark allure, and for Eliza Carter, it became an obsession. Eliza was 24, a sharp-eyed, dark-haired woman with a fierce determination that often made her stand out in a village where change was unwelcome. She had returned to Black Hollow after her mother's death, leaving behind the city and a life she'd carefully built for herself. Her return was not by choice, but necessity. The house she inherited was falling apart, and the small income she earned from her jobs barely kept her afloat. It started with whispers. On her first night back in the village, Eliza lay awake in her childhood bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. The house groaned and shifted, as old houses do, but this she heard a faint, lilting whisper that seemed to rise from the floorboards. She sat up, straining to hear, but the sound faded before she could make sense of it. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Wallace, her neighbor, if she'd heard anything unusual. The elderly woman's face turned pale, and she glanced toward the well visible from her kitchen window. "It's best not to ask about such things, dear," Mrs. Wallace said, clutching her tea mug like a talisman. "Some secrets are better left buried." But Eliza couldn't let it go. The whispers continued every night, growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to call her, pulling her from her restless dreams toward the window that overlooked the square. Each time, her gaze settled on the well, its dark mouth a silent invitation. One rainy afternoon, she decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and an old robe she found in the shed, she approached the well, her boots squelching in the mud. The air grew colder as she neared, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The stones were slick under her fingers as she leaned over the edge. Peering into the darkness, she turned on the flashlight, but its beam barely penetrated the void. The whispers grew louder, echoing up from the depths like a chorus of voices trapped in a cavern. "Eliza!" She frowned. The sound of her name, faint but unmistakable, rose from below. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, and nearly slipped on the wet grass. It wasn't her imagination. Somewhere something was down there. Determined to find answers, Eliza sought out Father Mason, the village priest. He was a kind but weary man, his faith worn thin by years of tending to a flock that believed more in the old ways than the new. When she mentioned the well, his expression hardened. "The well is a wound on this village," he said, lighting a candle in the dim church. "It has taken more than it has ever given. You would do well to leave it alone." "But why?" she pressed. "What's down there?" Father Mason hesitated, his gaze shifting to the stained glass window that depicted a triumphant saint driving out demons. "There are stories," he said finally. "Long ago, a traveler came to Black Hollow, a strange man with strange ways. He claimed to have knowledge of the old gods and offered the villagers prosperity in exchange for their loyalty. When they refused, he cursed the well. Afterward, the waters brought illness, and those who drank from it began to hear voices, dark whispers that drove them mad. The villagers sealed the well to contain the evil, but it was too late. The damage was done." "And you believe that?" Father Mason sighed. "I don't know what to believe, but I've seen enough to know the well is dangerous. Stay away, Eliza." But she couldn't. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They called her name over and over, mingling with sounds of weeping and laughter that sent chills down her spine. By the end of the week, Eliza made up her mind. She would go down into the well and find the source of the voices. Armed with a lantern, gloves, and a sturdy rope tied to a tree, she lowered herself into the darkness. The descent was slow and treacherous. The air grew colder, and the walls of the well seemed to close in around her. Water dripped from the stones, and the whispers surrounded her, no longer faint but loud and urgent. At first, she thought she was alone, but then she saw them carvings etched into the stone walls, strange symbols and faces twisted in agony, their eyes following her descent. Deeper she went until her feet touched solid ground. The bottom of the well was larger than she expected, a cavern carved out of the earth. Her lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls, revealing a pool of black water in the center. The whispers were deafening now, rising from the water like steam. "Eliza!" She turned, the lantern shaking in her hand. Standing at the edge of the pool was a figure, a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Her dress was tattered, her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. "Who are you?" Eliza demanded, her voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, a slow, unnatural movement. "You came," she whispered. "You heard us. You listened." "I want to know what's happening," Eliza said. "Why are you here? What do you want?" The woman stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the stone. "We are bound," she said, "bound by the water, by the curse. You must free us." Eliza took a step back. "Ow." Before the woman could answer, the ground beneath Eliza's feet shifted, the cavern rumbled, and the pool began to churn. From its depths rose, sheepish twisted, shadowy forms with glowing eyes and gaping mouths that reached for her. Panic surged through her. She turned and scrambled for the rope, her hands slipping on the wet stone as the whispers turned to screams. "Don't leave us," the woman cried, her voice echoing in the cavern. "You must finish what you've begun." Eliza climbed, her muscles burning, her heart racing. She didn't stop until she reached the surface, collapsing onto the grass as the night swallowed the sounds from below. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed her home, louder than ever, and she realized with growing dread that whatever she had disturbed in the well wasn't content to remain in the darkness. Eliza couldn't sleep. The whispers followed her everywhere now. They weren't confined to the well anymore. They seeped into her home, curling into the corners of her mind like smoke. They were louder at night, rising in a symphony of voices that clawed at her sanity. Some begged for help, some left, and others just repeated her name over and over in a sing-song tone that made her stomach churn. By the second week, she was struggling to function. The bags under her eyes grew darker, her appetite vanished, and every noise in the house made her flinch. The village, always suspicious of outsiders and those who broke the unspoken rules, began to notice. Mrs. Wallace, her concerned neighbor, stopped by with soup one evening. "You're not looking well, dear," she said, her kind eyes scanning Eliza's pale face. "Is everything all right?" Eliza forced a smile. "I'm fine, just not sleeping well." Mrs. Wallace glanced nervously toward the window, where the outline of the well was just visible in the distance. "You've been spending too much time near that cursed thing," she said, her voice low. "Whatever's in there, it doesn't like to be disturbed." Eliza didn't respond. She knew if she told Mrs. Wallace about the woman she'd seen in the well, or the shadowy shapes that clawed at her, the old woman would dismiss her as mad or worse, spread rumors that would reach the entire village by morning. But Eliza couldn't ignore the problem any longer. She needed answers. Her search led her to the outskirts of Black Hollow, to the crumbling manor of Victor Graves, the village's reclusive historian. Victor was in his 50s, a gaunt, sharp-featured man who rarely left his home. The villagers called him the keeper of stories, though they did so with a mix of respect and suspicion. Eliza knocked on the heavy oak door, and after a long pause, Victor opened it, squinting at her through wire-rimmed glasses. "I need your help," Eliza said before he could dismiss her. Victor hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. His home smelled of old paper and dust, and every surface was covered with books, maps, and artifacts. When she told him about the whispers, the woman in the well, and the strange carving she'd seen, his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said, pacing the room. "The well isn't just a relic, it's a gateway." "A gateway to what?" Eliza asked. Victor stopped and looked at her, his eyes sharp with a mix of fear and fascination. "To something old, something that was never meant to be disturbed." He rummaged through a stack of books, pulling out an ancient tome with a cracked leather cover. He flipped through the pages until he found a faded drawing of the well, surrounded by symbols identical to the ones Eliza had seen carved into the stone. "The well was sealed centuries ago," he explained. "The records are vague, but they mention a ritual of binding meant to trap something in its depths. Whatever is down there, it's not human." Eliza shivered, remembering the shadowy forms that had risen from the water. "But there was a woman," she said. "She wasn't like the others. She seemed real." Victor frowned. "If she's trapped down there, she's part of it. A fragment of whatever darkness was bound to the well. Then why is it calling to me? Victor hesitated. Maybe you've become the key. The well's seal is weakening, and you've disturbed it. If it's reaching out to you, it's because it sees you as a way to escape. That night, Eliza dreamed of the woman in the well. She was standing at the edge of the pool, her pale face illuminated by a faint, unnatural light. "You must come back," the woman whispered. Her voice was soothing, almost hypnotic. "You are the only one who can set us free." When Eliza woke, her body was drenched in sweat, and her palms burned with a strange heat. She turned on the light and gasped. Her hands were marked with the same symbols she'd seen carved into the well. She scrubbed at them with soap and water, but they wouldn't fade. They weren't drawn or painted, they were etched into her skin, as if branded. The whispers grew louder that day, relentless and demanding. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the well, its dark mouth and unspoken promise. Desperate for relief, she returned to Victor. He examined her hands, his brow furrowing. "These marks, they're part of the binding ritual. Whoever sealed the well centuries ago must have used similar symbols to trap whatever's inside." "What does that mean for me?" "It means the well is tethered to you now. If the seal breaks completely," he trailed off, his expression grim. Eliza's tether to the well began to affect the world around her. The whispers weren't confined to her home anymore. They spilled into the village. Mrs. Wallace reported hearing faint cries in the night, and other villagers claimed to see strange shadows flitting between the trees. Even the animals began to act strangely. Dogs refused to go near the square, their hackles raised and their eyes wide with fear. Birds circled the well but never landed, their cries sharp and panicked. The villagers started to murmur about Eliza. They saw her pale complexion, her sleepless eyes, and the way she lingered near the well, as if drawn by an invisible force. They began to avoid her, their suspicion turning to fear. Father Mason visited her one afternoon, his face lined with worry. "You need to leave Black Hollow," he said. "Whatever is happening to you, it's affecting all of us." "I can't leave," Eliza replied. "The whispers, they'll follow me." Father Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then you must resist them. Don't let them take you." But it was already too late. On the third night after the marks appeared, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They were no longer disembodied voices, but full-fledged apparitions that filled her home. Shadowy figures loomed in the corners of her vision, their faces shifting and indistinct. "Eliza," they called, their voices layered and discordant. "Come to us. Finish what you started." Unable to bear it any longer, she grabbed her lantern and headed for the well. The village square was eerily quiet, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The well loomed ahead, its dark mouth gaping like a wound. As she approached, the whispers grew softer, almost reverent. The symbols on her hands began to glow, faint and pulsing like a heartbeat. She peered into the well, her lantern casting flickering light into its depths. The water was still, but the shadows beneath its surface seemed to writhe and shift. "Eliza," the woman's voice rose from the depths, clear and mournful. "We're waiting." Eliza tightened her grip on the lantern, her heart racing. She didn't know what awaited her below, but she knew one thing for certain. The well wasn't just calling her, it was pulling her in. The night swallowed Black Hollow in a suffocating darkness, as if the sky itself had been blotted out. The village square, once familiar, now felt alien to Eliza as she stood at the edge of the well. The lantern in her trembling hand cast flickering light over the slick stones, and the glowing marks on her palms pulsed faintly, as if alive. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were in her head, in her chest, a rhythmic thrum that made it impossible to think clearly. "Come to us, Eliza." She couldn't fight it anymore. There was no sleep, no peace, no escape. Whatever lived in the well had bound itself to her, and every moment she delayed felt like a tightening noose. She tied the rope securely to the nearby tree, her movements shaky but deliberate. This time, there was no hesitation. With the lantern strapped to her side, she began her descent. The cold bit into her skin as she climbed deeper into the well. The damp, moss-covered stones glistened in the lantern's dim glow, and the carvings on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, their meaning just beyond comprehension. "Eliza," the voices were stronger now, no longer disjointed whispers but full sentences, overlapping and echoing. Some were familiar, like the soft voice of her late mother. Others were alien, guttural, and wrong. "You should have stayed away," one voice hissed. "You belong to us now," another murmured, almost lovingly. Her foot slipped, and her heart lurched as she scrambled to regain her grip. The rope swayed, and for a moment, she hung there, suspended over the black void below. Then she saw Ada faint, unnatural light emanating from the bottom. It wasn't the soft glow of moonlight or fire, but something colder, more alien. Finally, her boots touched solid ground. The cavern was larger than she remembered, its ceiling stretching high above her like the ribs of some ancient beast. The pool of water at the center was still and black, its surface reflecting the strange, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The woman was waiting for her. The figure stepped out of the shadows, her bare feet making no sound against the wet stone. Up close, she was even more haunting. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly, their gaze piercing but empty. Her tattered dress clung to her thin frame, and her hair hung in damp strands around her face. "Eliza," the woman said, her voice soft but echoing unnaturally in the cavern. You call me," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. "We want freedom. We want release." "Who are you?" Eliza demanded. "What are you?" "I was like you once," the woman replied, her gaze distant, drawn to the well, bound by its curse. "But I could not finish what needed to be done." Eliza took a cautious step back. "Finish what? What are you talking about?" The woman's expression darkened, her glowing eyes narrowing. "The well is not just a place. It is a prison, a doorway. Those who came before sealed it, but their work was incomplete. The darkness festers, grows. The whispers are its tendrils, reaching for the world above. You must complete the binding or everything will be consumed." Before Eliza could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The still water in the pool churned violently, and shapes began to rise from its depths, dark, shifting figures with glowing eyes and elongated limbs. They moved like smoke, their forms never fully solid, but their presence was suffocating. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a deafening cacophony. The woman turned to face the shadows, her expression calm but resolute. "They will not let you leave until it is done." "What do I have to do?" Eliza shouted over the noise. The woman turned back to her, reaching out to grasp Eliza's hands. Her touch was icy, but the marks on Eliza's palms flared with warmth. "You must seal it," the woman said. "The symbols on your skin are the key. Place your hands on the stones, speak the words, and the well will be bound once more." "And if I don't?" The woman's eyes darkened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then the darkness will escape, and it will devour everything." The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing. One of them lashed out, its smoky tendrils wrapping around Eliza's ankle. She screamed, stumbling backward, but the woman grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. "There is no time," the woman cried. "You must act now." Eliza ran to the edge of the pool, the glowing symbols on her hands illuminating the carvings in the stone. They seemed to pulse in time with her racing heartbeat, as if waiting for her to act. The shadows closed in, their voices screaming and wailing. One of them lunged at her, its claws raking across her shoulder, and pain seared through her. But she didn't stop. She pressed her hands against the stone, the marks on her palms aligning perfectly with the symbols. A surge of heat shot through her, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The woman's voice cut through the chaos, speaking in a language Eliza didn't understand. The words seemed to pour into her mind, and before she could think, she was repeating them, her voice trembling but steady. The symbols on the stone flared to life, their light blinding. The shadows recoiled, their forms writhing and distorting as the light grew brighter. The pool began to bubble and hiss, and the cavern shook violently. Eliza's voice rose to a scream as she finished the final words of the ritual. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a deafening roar, the shadows were sucked back into the pool, their screams echoing as they vanished into the darkness. The light from the symbols faded, and the cavern grew still. Eliza collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. The woman knelt beside her, her expression unreadable. "It is done," the woman said softly. Eliza looked up at her, her vision blurry. "What happens now?" The woman smiled faintly, a sad, haunting expression. "The well is sealed, but the cost is always the same. You are its keeper now." Eliza's blood ran cold. What do you mean?" "The marks will never fade," the woman said, rising to her feet. "The whispers will remain, but they will be quiet for now. You must guard the well, ensure it remains sealed. If the binding weakens again." Her voice trailed off, and she began to fade, her form dissolving into mist. "Wait," Eliza cried. "What about me? How do I stop it from happening again?" But the woman was gone. Eliza was alone in the cavern, the silence oppressive. The pool was still now, its surface reflecting the faint light of her lantern. She climbed back up the rope, her limbs aching, her mind racing. When she emerged into the cool night air, the village was quiet, the well standing silently behind her. But she knew the truth. The whispers would never truly stop. The darkness would always be there, waiting, watching, and now it was her burden to bear. The days after the ritual passed in a haze of unease and exhaustion. Eliza walked through the village like a ghost, her body pressed but her mind trapped in the depths of the well. The marks on her hands no longer glowed, but they pulsed faintly, like the embers of a dying fire. She could still feel the well's pull, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore. The whispers were quieter now, but they never fully left. They lingered on the edges of her hearing, a low murmur that ebbed and flowed like the tide. At night, she dreamed of the cavern, the woman, and the shifting shadows beneath the surface of the pool. The villagers, sensing the change in her, avoided her entirely. Even Mrs. Wallace, once so kind and concerned, now crossed the street when she saw Eliza coming. Father Mason had stopped by once, offering a strained prayer and an even more strained smile, but even he seemed reluctant to linger. Eliza didn't blame them. She had become an extension of the well, its keeper, its warden, and its prisoner. For weeks, life in Black Hollow returned to a semblance of normalcy. The animals no longer avoided the square, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the village began to lift. But Eliza couldn't relax. She knew the well was merely dormant, not silenced. Victor Graves, a historian, visited her one rainy afternoon. He stood awkwardly on her porch, his long coat dripping with water. "I've been doing more research," he said as she led him in. Eliza gave him a weary look. "What did you find?" Victor placed a bundle of old, yellowed papers on her table. "The well seal has been broken and repaired before. Every time, it gets weaker. The marks on your hands, they're not just a connection to the well. They're a promise, a binding." Eliza's stomach twisted. "What kind of binding?" He hesitated, his thin fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coat. "The keeper is a tether. The well's power will remain contained as long as the keeper lives." Her breath caught. "And what happens if I die?" Victor's expression darkened. "The seal breaks completely, and whatever is inside, it escapes." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. There was no escape from this. Her life was no longer her own. It was tied irrevocably to the darkness she had bound. Weeks turned into months, and the whispers grew louder again. Eliza began to notice subtle changes in the village. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. The air around the well felt colder, even on the warmest days. One morning, a villager named Thomas approached her in the square, his face pale and his hands shaking. "I saw something last night," he whispered, "near the well, a figure." Eliza's heart sank. What did it look like? Thomas glanced around nervously before leaning closer. It was tall, too tall, and its eyes, they glowed. She didn't need him to say more. She knew the shadows were stirring again. That night, she stood by the well, clutching a lantern and listening to the faint whispers rising from its depths. "Let us out. You can't hold us forever." The voices were angrier now, more insistent. The shadows in the water shifted and writhed, testing the edges of the binding. Desperate for guidance, Eliza returned to Victor's manor. The historian had become her reluctant ally, his curiosity about the well tempered by a growing fear of its power. "There has to be a way to strengthen the seal," she said, pacing his study. "Something I can do to stop this." Victor shook his head. "The seal is tied to you, Eliza. As long as you live, it holds. But the well is older than any of us. Its power is insidious. It will find ways to weaken you, to break you." She stopped pacing, her hands clenched into fists. "Then what am I supposed to do? Just wait for it to consume me?" Victor hesitated, then pulled a book from one of the many stacks on his desk. "There is one thing, a final binding. It would seal the well completely, forever." Her pulse quickened. "Ah." His expression was grim. "It requires a sacrifice. The life of the keeper." The room fell silent. Eliza sank into a chair, her mind racing. "If I die, the well opens. But if I die as part of the ritual," Victor nodded, "the seal would become permanent. The well would be closed forever." The next few days were a blur. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows bolder. Villagers began reporting strange, sighting figures standing at the edge of the forest, eyes glowing in the darkness. Livestock disappeared, and children woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't describe. The tension in Black Hollow reached a breaking point. The villagers began to blame Eliza openly, their fear turning to anger. "She brought this on us," Mrs. Wallace whispered to a group of others. "She's cursed." Father Mason tried to calm them, but his own fear was evident. We must have faith, he said, though his voice trembled. Eliza heard it all but said nothing. She knew they were right. That night, as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, she made her decision. Eliza returned to the well, her lantern in one hand and Victor's book in the other. The ritual for the final binding was simple but absolute. Once it was performed, there would be no coming back. She tied the rope to the tree once more and began her descent. The cavern was as she remembered, vast, cold, and oppressive. The pool at its center churned violently, the shadows within clawing at its edges. Eliza, the voices hissed. You can't stop us. She knelt by the edge of the pool, opening the book and tracing the symbols on her hands. The words of the ritual burned in her mind, and as she began to speak them, the cavern shook. The shadows screamed, their forms rising from the pool and lunging toward her. But this time, she didn't flinch. She pressed her hands to the stone, the symbols flaring with a blinding light. Her voice rose, steady and unyielding, as she spoke the final words of the binding. The shadows recoiled, their screams turning into a deafening roar. The pool glowed with an intense, unnatural light, and the cavern began to collapse around her. Eliza closed her eyes, her voice never faltering. She felt the energy of the well pulling at her, tearing at her very soul, but she didn't stop. When the light faded, the cavern was silent. The pool was still, its surface smooth as glass. The symbols on the stone had dimmed, their power spent. Eliza's body lay motionless by the edge of the pool, her face calm, her hand still glowing faintly. The whispers were gone. In the village above, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The villagers, sensing the change, ventured cautiously into the square, but Eliza did not return. Victor found her a week later, after mustering the courage to descend into the well. He found her body, lifeless but peaceful, and the well completely sealed. The darkness was gone, its power extinguished. Eliza had kept her promise. Black Hollow prospered in the years that followed. The well became a forgotten relic, its dark history buried along with its keeper. But sometimes, on quiet nights, the villagers claimed to hear faint whispers carried on the wind. And those who ventured too close to the well swore they felt a presence watching, waiting. Because some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.